Vishal Mangalwadi, The Book That Made Your World, and we're picking up on page 309. And we've been in a conversation about how that the biblical framework created the culture and the capacity for people to not only develop modern medicine, but to continue it and pass it on generationally, which is something, a point that he makes. The Indian culture produced a lot of interesting things in regard to medicine, and the Greeks had their moment in that too, but none of them were able to sustain that for generations and create what we might now know as modern medicine, or appreciate it as modern medicine. So his proposition is that the culture itself is what creates the bedrock and the framing and the possibility of these things escalating and synthesizing and increasing in value and effectiveness. And so here we're going to open up a conversation about Indian medicine, and he's always going to go back to the Indian subcontinent because that's his origins and that's where he grew up. Okay, so we'll start reading, and Molly, you're just I guess for our forever designated reader, and so if you want to start there. Why don't you pick up on the top of 309 at that quotation from Sydenham.
Whoever applies himself to medicine should seriously weigh the following considerations. First, that he will one day have to render an account to the supreme judge of the lives of sick people entrusted to his care. Next, by whatever skill or knowledge he may, by the divine favor, become possessed of, should be devoted above all things to the glory of God and the welfare of the human race. Thirdly, he must remember that it is no mean or ignoble creature that he deals with. We may ascertain the worth of the human race, since for its sake God's only begotten Son became man and thereby ennobled the nature that he took upon him. Finally, the physician should bear in mind that he himself is not exempt from the common lot, but is subject to the same laws of mortality and disease as his fellows, and he will care for the sick with more diligence and tenderness if he remembers that he himself is their fellow sufferer.
So in our discussions previously about the Indian culture and Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and our more modern manifestations of communist governments and communist societies, they lack this God consciousness, and they lack this idea of reciprocity, and they lack the sense of that every person is valuable before God because they're made in the image of God. And so for medicine to be really effective, the practitioner has to be empathetic. You have to care about the other person. And that's going to occur to some degree, or less or more, depending on the individuals that are involved. But in terms of a culture itself, those ancient cultures did not offer this sort of awareness about the patient and the doctor and their relationship. And so you get the biblical story of the Good Samaritan, and the Good Samaritan stops and pours in the oil and the wine, and he's a type of Jesus. And so that's a medicinal approach. He's doctoring his wounds, and he's helping him and serving him and ministering to him. And that's a biblical example of the biblical culture, and that is easily translated into the practice of modern medicine. So you can see that Judeo-Christian foundation creates a much better ethos for a caring, serving, ministry-oriented relationship between doctors or healthcare professionals and their patients. All right, read on.
While Greek, Roman, Arabian, and Indian medical traditions stagnated or died, Siddham's tradition continues to flourish after 4 centuries because it was an integral part of a larger culture shaped by the Bible. The medical scene in India can help one grasp this point.
Yeah, and it is the nature of the kingdom of God to spiral upward and outward and to get better and to become more complex. And that happens in individuals, it happens in larger groups, families, cultures. A church family should be the rule for every system that is built on this Christian or biblical foundation. All right, Indian medicine.
Indian medical students and doctors constitute the largest ethnic minority in many prestigious medical institutions in America. Some Indians imagine that it is due to the fact that the history of medicine in India goes back 3,000 or more years. Ayurveda, the ancient Indian system of medicine, has been popularized in the West by Deepak Chopra and others, but Ayurveda is not the only medical invention of India. The first textbooks on surgery are Sushruta's Samhita. These were compiled between the 1st century BC and the 7th century AD. Sushruta is said to have been the first to perform cataract operations at a time when even the great Hippocratic tradition does not mention it. Plastic surgery is another Indian invention. The need for plastic surgery serves as an illustration of a culture's impact on medicine. If someone behaved shamefully in traditional India, for example, by committing adultery, then the penalty was the loss of one's nose. So many noses were cut off that as early as 2,000 years ago we needed plastic surgery. No evidence exists that Greco-Roman civilization had the idea of plastic surgery. To Ayurveda, cataract operations, and plastic surgery, we could add massage and aromatherapy as examples of India's pioneering and medical expertise. But this glorious picture of medicine in ancient India has to be contrasted with the reality encapsulated in Ida Scudder's story from barely a century ago. Ida, a young American woman, a graduate of D.L. Moody's School for Young Ladies at Northfield, Massachusetts, came to visit her missionary father in South India in 1892. One night, a Brahmin, the highest caste Hindu man, came to her and said that his wife was ready to deliver a baby, but it was a very painful labor, so would she please come and help deliver the baby? Ida replied, "No, I'm just a girl. I'm not a doctor. I know nothing about medicine. My father is the physician. You take him." The Brahmin answered, "I can't take a man to see my wife." A little later, a Muslim man came and asked if she would help his wife, also experiencing a difficult labor. Ida said, "Look, I'm just a girl visiting my dad. Why don't you take him?" The Muslim, echoing the Brahmin, wouldn't take a man to see his wife. Next, a man from the Mudaliar caste came and pleaded with her to come and help deliver his wife's baby. She refused again. By the morning, all 3 women were dead. That shook Ida. She believed God was saying something to her. She came back to America, trained at Cornell Medical College, and then returned to India in 1900 to establish a one-bed clinic which grew into the Vellore Christian Medical College. Mahatma Gandhi called it the best medical college in Asia, and it became the largest in India. In some ways, it may be the best in the world. The professors serve as mentors. They do not practice privately. All their time is available to students and patients. The college is also on the cutting edge of developing medical education through distance learning.
Okay, so what happened there? And we led into that with the fact that India had already developed some level of plastic surgery, and they had manuals or they had texts on surgical procedures. And so, and in modern culture, people like Deepak Chopra have made allusion to how wonderful the mysterious ancient arts of Indian medicine are, and they've kind of glamorized all that. But what are we looking at here at ground level in this story? You don't have to answer all at once. Okay, so they they have some degree. Oh, you got it on your phone. Technologies. They have some advanced knowledge of medicine and surgery and plastic surgery because of their barbaric practices. When you cut off a lot of people's noses, you get good at cutting off people's noses and maybe finding out how to ameliorate the mortality rate because you bleed to death when somebody cuts your nose off or choke on your own blood or something like that. It was pretty barbaric. But so they figured out a little bit about plastic surgery, And so that sounds like, wow, they were pretty advanced way back then. But when it comes to just delivering these babies, they are backward and they are unsophisticated and they are unable to do this at any level of expertise. And this young lady sees this and feels a calling. And what does she import to India? What does she bring into India?
The one-bed clinic.
She brings in a one-bed clinic that one day becomes a very, very advanced, productive, effective hospital, And there's always been a need there. And they obviously have some smart people there that have developed some creative and wise ways of doing medicine, but they can't even effectively and cleanly deliver their babies. And it goes back to those original conversations about not valuing human life, about the caste structure that creates a problem for the way that people feel about other people. And there's no real compassion and caring and empathy there because it's not a Judeo-Christian foundation. This young lady was trained in a place that was developed on a foundation of Judeo-Christian principles. And then she exports that to India and begins to, by compassion and by caring and by empathy, deliver good medical care to the people of India. They could not originate that on their own. They couldn't produce that on their own. And Magavati's point is you have to have the cultural surround. You have to have the foundational base for that to develop at any to any degree of significance. Okay, anything else about that? We're on page 310 or 311, somewhere in there. Yeah, second paragraph, 311. Okay, anything else on this? All right, read on.
Heroic efforts of missionaries such as Ida Scudder produced an amazing result. After a century, there are more women doctors in India than in any other country in the world. But what happened to the tremendous beginning in medicine that India had made 2,000 years earlier? In the year 1900, why didn't a city have female doctors or nurses who could deliver a baby? Several factors caused the decline and stagnation of the Indian medical tradition. One was the attitude toward knowledge. There were individuals in India with medical genius, but our culture saw knowledge as power, something to be kept secret and guarded, not disseminated. Our learned physicians trained their sons and also their students if they surrendered their minds and bodies to their gurus or their Shias, disciples. Knowledge gave authority. To remain the expert, you could not allow your expertise to be questioned by your disciples. The disciples had to surrender their minds to the guru's authority. This attitude toward knowledge could not create and sustain an academic culture where peers and students could challenge, reject, and improve the medical techniques they had received. Thus, India had intellectual giants, but our religious tradition failed to build academic communities. Individual genius, knowledge, and excellence in technology are insufficient to build a medical culture. It requires community effort.
I mean, if you remember the biblical story of the Exodus, there were midwives in Egypt that were delivering children, as a profession. And Pharaoh was commissioning them, trying to get them to kill the Jewish babies, the Hebrew babies. But I mean, almost every rural culture knows how to deliver babies. What's wrong in that ancient cultural setting of India? Well, they didn't value women, and they didn't believe that women could be used in those ways. So they didn't train them. And then handling things like the birth of a baby was thought to be maybe servants' work, and so it was demeaning, and so nobody of any real skill wanted to be involved in that. So there's a lot of things that work there, but all of it bubbles up from their theological underpinnings. All right, read on.
In addition, there was the problem of caste. Only the lower caste were supposed to undertake service professions that appeared dirty or degrading. Only the lowest caste women could serve as midwives. Besides, all women were second-class human beings, and their health and safety were not priorities in our villages. When Ruth and I started serving the poor in central India, one of our first priorities was the training of village health workers. We found that illiterate midwives were delivering babies in totally unhygienic ways. Tetanus was a common occurrence because they cut umbilical cords with a sickle. Then they used rags to try and stop a woman's bleeding after delivery. Washing wounds in dirty water increased infections. These elementary problems were huge issues because midwifery was seen as a dirty job to be done by the lowest caste. These cultural attitudes precluded the development of gynecological care in our culture.
Yeah, so nobody's growing in these skill sets. The culture's not being serviced. People, women and babies are dying because of this, and it's all because of the theological foundation that they have suffered under for thousands of years, and they haven't managed to dig themselves out of that. And another thing that comes to mind when you're reading this is that there are animals in the field having young all the time, and they just have it, and they do whatever they're doing, and they go on about their business. And I don't know that we have any records on the mortality rate of wild animals or domestic animals. And I know there's sometimes problems, and veterinarians are called in to help with those situations. But quite often, those brute animals have successful deliveries out in the field all by themselves. And you think, it's the curse, because in the curse, part of that was the woman is having all of this difficulty in childbearing. And so it presents a unique set of circumstances there, that there are women that can have babies by themselves. And there's stories about people having deliveries in the middle of a field and then going right back to work in the field. Pioneer people, or maybe slaves, or people that didn't have a whole lot of choice. You got to get the crop in. I don't know. I can't verify the reality of that report, but I do know that we as humans have to have, most of the time, some assistance. I mean, Kara and Justin brought a new one into the world yesterday, and so they had a surround of medical professionals and great infrastructure and wonderful setting, and all of that fueled and supplied by a very sophisticated supply chain and educational structure. All of those things are woven together. You don't just go in there and have a baby and it's isolated and it's an event all unto itself, but it is surrounded by technologies and invention, and it all rests on a foundation of the Word of God, and the empathy and the caring and the release of individual potential, all of those things, because all of the advancements that we have, I think sometimes about Brother Bert and his medical missions team recently down in Central America, and a good number of years ago down in Ecuador, and they had to bring all of their equipment with them. And they sometimes down there used what was available. But we kind of laugh now. Brother Bert would go to a local hardware store and buy this and that and the other, and come back and repair the anesthesia equipment, and they were blessed to have somebody who was half anesthesiologist and half mechanic. He could do things like that. But But that wouldn't last long there in that setting. Even if they had the great expertise, somebody could make a difference there, but it wouldn't produce the results that you get here because it's not a part of that overarching cultural, economic, educational surround, that cultural mix. And so it gets so sophisticated and so woven together, and we just take it for granted. We turn on the light switch and lights, but it's not happening all over the world like that. Well, why? Well, because we just have this tremendous upsurge of invention and design and the personal individual fulfillment and all of the things that come with that Judeo-Christian cultural package. And Magavati's point is simply it just doesn't exist in other places. And so what we consider sometimes to be very simple things are extraordinarily difficult in other places in the world. And if you get a chance, listen to a Peterson podcast interview with a lady named Magat Wade. She's from Northern Africa, grew up there, and then immigrated with her parents at 7 to India, and then got her education in France. And then when she wanted to apply and to become, she came to America because she saw it as the place where you could really spread your wings. And she wound up in Silicon Valley during the time of a lot of startups. And so she was involved with a lot of those things and did really, really well. But kept asking herself the question, why is it so difficult? I mean, cooking a meal is so difficult in her homeland because they don't have all the modern conveniences. And it's 2023, and they still don't have all the modern conveniences. The world's doing a lot better. People are eating better, and people are not as totally deprived as they have been throughout history. But it's still, when they do come into technological or industrial advancements, it's something they import from the West, and then they make a go of it. But the ethos of a Christian, Judeo-Christian cultural foundation is hands down, it seems, the very, very most productive setting for people to find themselves in. And anyway, so this is what he's dealing with here. All right, read on.
Karma became another philosophical factor preventing a culture of care. A person's suffering was believed to be a result of her or his karma, deeds in a previous life. In other words, suffering was cosmic justice. To interfere with cosmic justice is like breaking into a jail and setting a prisoner free. If you cut short someone's suffering, you would actually add to his suffering because he would need to come back to complete his due quota of suffering. You do not help a person when you interfere with the cosmic law of justice. As human beings, we Indians have as much natural empathy as anyone else in the world, but the doctrine of karma prevented us from turning that natural empathy into institutions and traditions of caring. We had no dearth of gods, goddesses, and saints in our country, but missionaries like Ida Scudder and Mother Teresa of Calcutta had to come from outside to help us see that the dying, destitute on our streets were human beings, albeit with rotting bodies. While most Hindus honor the missionary spirit, those like Aaron Shourie, who are anxious to preserve Hindu culture, rightly see Christian missions as their biggest threat.
Okay, so when he says that we Indians have as much natural empathy as anyone else in the world, what's your impression of that? It doesn't seem to be true, given what, and I understand what he's saying and his impulse to say that. We care about people as much as anybody else does. But if they did care, and he's the one that made the point that they built the Taj Mahal, but they didn't create wheelbarrows, because they didn't care about the people that were carrying the stone or all the supplies and materials and everything. human beings were expendable. You just use them up and wear them out and get another one because they had plenty of people. But they didn't care about them. And they didn't care about the poor and the underclass because of the caste structure and because of this business of karma. How dare you insinuate yourself between somebody and their penalty for their previous behavior in another life, And so I would challenge the idea. He makes a lot of really good points, but I don't believe you could justify the fact that Indians have as much natural empathy as anyone else in the world. Because if you did, it seems like you would be performing better and creating systems that would alleviate suffering. All right, just thinking. Read on.
Buddhism did teach karuna, compassion, as a high value, but Buddhist compassion could not develop into a culture of care. This was partly because Buddhism, too, believed in the doctrine of karma, and partly because it taught that we must not get attached to anyone. The Buddha had to renounce his own wife and son to find enlightenment. He saw attachment as a cause of suffering. Detachment, therefore, became an important religious virtue that turned Buddhist karuna into compassion without commitment to another person. Those whose commitment was to their own spiritual enlightenment did not have the motivation to develop a scientific medical tradition.
Okay, so if the phrase compassion without commitment, what does that sound like to you?
Not very helpful, just more like
a Pharisee.
It sounds like faith without works, And then so I want to go back and I want to have a conversation about define compassion for me. I care about them. Well, what are you doing? Not much. So, well, let's define compassion then. Let's determine what that might be. So here again, he's saying, they have compassion. And I would say, they're like the ideological young people in the streets of America and on college campuses of America today who purport to believe and care about so many things, but they're not really doing anything. They're not doing anything. They're waving placards in the street, burning a police car or something like that. But they're not, none of those activities are actually doing anything positive to affect a positive change in somebody's life. So you have to beware of definitional things like this, because people loosely use words like love, people always professing their love and not acting that way at all, So it's interesting here. So at any rate, here we go, Hindus, Buddhists, and we're not gratuitously throwing stones at people, but in these discussions, I don't mind speaking about these things very straightforwardly, and you're not throwing a class of people into the trash bin of history and saying they are of no value because God died for all of them. They have as much worth as anybody else in any other culture. But the point here is they're just not producing anything that's throughout history tremendously beneficial for their fellow man or for their own life and aspirations. Okay, any conversation about that?
So his point maybe that they have the capacity for it, but just they were taught not to do anything about it.
Yeah, so then the question is, do they have the capacity for it?
Right.
You're pretty much formed up by the time you're 4 years of age.
Right.
Then you're out in the world of your peers. But if you're a psychopath, it's hard to turn that, And if you're antisocial, it's hard to turn that. Even like an 8 or 10-year-old, hard to change that framing. So to say they have the capacity for it they might have had the capacity for it downstream, upstream, where before they were framed and formed, there's a lot of cultures that have a wide variety of different practices and ideologies. Like the Native American population, they thought thieving was really a good thing to do, and dismembering your adversaries on the battlefield was a good thing to do, because if you met them in the world to come, you wanted them to be at a disadvantage, so you cut them all to pieces, and so that's a culturally inculcated mindset. Well, we would call that savage, but you bring that in and try to make it sit on a church pew and turn it around, that's really, really difficult. So, the idea of God changing people and really changing lives, that's a huge idea. The fact that really is possible. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creation. And so these cultural imprints are so very, very strong. And some of you know that because you run into those things trying to live for God. You keep running into your cultural imprint, your familial tradition, or your biological predispositions, those kinds of things. All of those things keep rearing their heads. And we, by will and by application of the Word of God, we put those things in their places. But so I don't know, and I don't mean to be nitpicking here, but to say they have the capacity for it, but they're not practicing it. I don't know. I don't know what they have the capacity for, because they've been framed up by a culture that doesn't support any of these positive things. But I don't want to dissuade you from offering opinions and conversation, because it's like pulling eye teeth here, so I don't want to.
Well, if they were in the right setting, then, and they were framed to do something, then that's
exactly.
Like
6-month baby is raw material. Do anything you want to do to the degree that it has natural capacities, and then you're off to the races there, because that's like a miracle of God. All right, read on.
The decline of Indian medicine ought to serve as a warning to the West. Our failure demonstrates that ultimately the development of the medical profession cannot depend on technical knowledge and expertise alone. A society with medical genius could destroy the future of its medicine. In the final analysis, medicine requires a caring culture that brings together the heart and mind to create and sustain appropriate values, laws, and socioeconomic systems that nurture medicine.
Okay. There has been, and perhaps it went further than a discussion, there has been a discussion and maybe some research into synthesizing smallpox, which is extremely, extremely contagious, and Ebola, which is extremely, extremely fatal. The good thing about Ebola is it's so fatal that it doesn't spread much because people can't get out and get around with it. But people that think wicked thoughts have often looked at that and thought, man, if we could introduce that into New York City and it had a high contagion rate, we could destabilize our political military enemy, And that those kinds of ideas pop up in Tom Clancy novels and those kinds of things. But we're not very far removed from a situation where our National Institute for Health and the American government, using American taxpayer monies, funded research in a little creepy place called Wuhan, China, and were trying to determine how to transmit viruses usually associated with bats to human hosts and to enhance them in a thing that they call gain of function. We want them to, we see how they operate, we want them to operate in a different way or a better way so that we can use them for some purpose. Now, question is, why would you ever be looking at that? Why would a scientist ever look at that? And what kind of a scientist would recoil from looking at that? Those are two questions.
Look at that to weaponize it.
Yeah, look at it to weaponize it. So that's a scientist that's looking to use science to create mayhem and destruction and all of that, right? There's a lot of research that went into how to effectively kill the Jews, because they found out killing millions of people is not all that easy. It's pretty expensive too. So they used gas on them, and the gas they used was chemically like a pesticide because they viewed them as vermin. And then they burned them up in those crematoriums and all of it. They had a pretty good little system going before the end of the war. And that's about what they did. So what were their motives? We want to kill a bunch of people and we want to destroy Europe. You know, those kinds of things. So what kind of scientist works on something like that?
The bad guy.
Yeah. So, you know, that you can't be neutral about that. You want to do what? You want to mix smallpox and Ebola? You want to get a bat virus and create it in a system where it's going to spread all over the world and destabilize all the world economies and our supply chains and everything else? Who in the world's doing that? Well, maybe our greatest economic military adversary at present might like to do that because they've got 4 times the people we do. They could lose a few 100 million. Wouldn't bother them at all. There'd be fewer people to take care of, you know? So, you know, we had an early conversation about good and bad, defining terms, you know? Well, I don't have to look at that very long to say that's bad. Kyle identified the guy doing that as a bad guy, you know? And so, we are here, we're reading about, in the final analysis, medicine creates a caring culture that brings together the heart and mind to create, sustain appropriate values. Well, it does if you're in an ethos that values those things. But if you're in a communist construct, then you might be in there like witches around a big black pot, like bubble, bubble, toil, and trouble. Here we go. We're going to destabilize the world with this bat virus. And that seems to be what they did. Turned it loose in a wet market. Here we go. You know, we have young, healthy adults in this church that have heart problems now because of either the virus or the vaccine. Pick your poison. I don't know. I don't know what caused it. But that was pretty far-reaching, and the impact of that is just hard to calculate this close in. I truly believe it changed the course of an election and changed the course of our nation, for sure. Okay, well, the further we get from this Judeo-Christian foundation, the more we're going to run into things like this. Read on.
Building a culture conducive to medicine calls for wisdom, and that has been in short supply lately in America. A prominent Hollywood documentarian activist went as far as urging America to follow Cuba. Healthcare dominated the public square throughout 2009. It is likely to be a hot issue in 2011 as well.
Yeah, now what kind of a person is telling us that we need to follow the medical model in Cuba?
Not very wise.
Not wise. What else?
Probably communist socialists.
Oh, without a doubt. Because Cuba's like the North Star in the West. But have any of you been to Cuba, or have you seen anything, any documentaries or pictures of Cuba?
Yes.
They're like frozen in 1950. And their medical industry is frozen somewhere in third world status. So why would a bureaucrat or a political type, administrative type, want us to follow after Cuba? Well, because it's good for us? Well, no, it's they want to tear down the Judeo-Christian framework. And if you'll follow the conversation, it's in entertainment, it's in education, it's in the political conversation, it's in everything we do in our culture. And the cohesive thread that runs through it all is the destruction of the Judeo-Christian foundation.
It's all antichrist.
It is exactly that. So you find the strongest representation of the Christ in the West, so you need to tear that down. So, yeah, it only makes sense if you look at it through that lens. Read on.
Today, many Indian physicians are at the cutting edge of medical technology in the West. Yet some of my Indian friends in the UK have started a blood insurance company for those traveling to India. They assure their clients that in an event of an emergency, medically clean blood will be flown from England within 2 hours.
Okay, what is that a symptom of? What is it? What does this indicate? There are several things in that. The discussion of Indian physicians in the West, but blood insurance for people traveling to India, what does that indicate?
Lack of supply.
Huh?
There's nothing there.
Yeah, they don't
Lack
have.
of supply.
Yeah, and the blood they do have is,
It's contaminated.
well, you have questions about it, you know?
Right.
It's just like static rule, third world travel, don't drink the water. Just don't drink the water. That means don't eat the ice, don't get a Coke with ice cubes in it, and don't get a salad that's been washed in the water. It takes a few bouts of disease to realize all of these things. We had a nice young couple on a trip that we took to Guatemala, and we went through all of it. We went through everything. Told them as well as we could tell them. And I met them coming out of the market, and they were just having a good time, and they were eating fresh pineapple. I said, "Where'd you get that pineapple?" They said, "We bought it in the market." I said, "What did they cut it with?" They picked up an old knife that hadn't been washed since World War II. And those kids were sick. I mean, violently sick for days. It was like, I did not say a specific thing about pineapples in the marketplace. But if you're going to get it yourself, cut it yourself, clean it up yourself, all of that. But so third world conditions still in India. But is there anything wrong with their people per se? No, because when they come to the West, you have tremendous professional representation from India in hospitals all over the world now, and they've been trained in the West. But their system, their cultural surround, their theological foundation is a drag on every progressive thing they might attempt to do in India itself. Which, when we talk about all of this, are you able to boil this down to like individual things? If this is true concerning a nation, what does that mean for my individual life? What does it mean for my household and my family? What does it mean for our local church? What should our target be? We want to be more like the third world. I see churches moving away from fundamentalist ideas. And this conversation should give you cold chills when you see that, because they're moving away from the very thing that produces all the good stuff in our culture and our society. And they don't understand how important the church is. And so I don't want to get more liberal in my thinking about any of this stuff. If anything, I want to get more biblically oriented in everything that I do. All right, Molly.
Supplying clean blood to India is understandable. It is humiliating, however, when international athletes and sports teams have to bring their own bottled water to India for drinking. We do not lack the ability or the resource to provide clean blood or water. The problem is that Indians living in the West have a hard time trusting their culture.
Why would they bring their own bottled water? Huh?
The pineapple.
Previous experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you think they're just out behind the station here filling up those water bottles. There's nothing, nobody's protecting the water supply with this stuff. So, and why do they think that? Because they live there. Because they know how people are there. And you look around us, we're becoming more and more third worldish in a lot of areas. Our inner cities are turning third world on us. And it's simply because of political positions and the new word from academia coming down and filtering into the culture. But it's something you really don't want to experience here. All right, read on.
Cultural transformation. A small town in Maharashtra state was
Easy for you to say.
the 50th anniversary of the local Christian hospital. During the celebration, an elderly public figure narrated the following incident from the early days of the hospital. A poor family brought a woman to the hospital for surgery. She needed blood, but no one from her extended family could donate his or her blood. Deeply disappointed by their fear and lack of compassion, and realizing the urgency of her situation, the missionary surgeon donated his own blood and then proceeded to operate on the dying woman. The town was baffled. Why would a surgeon do such a thing? Worldviews blind people so that critics cannot begin to comprehend that the surgeon was following a Savior who had given his own blood to give us life.
Yeah, so what's the difference in the surgeon and the family? And again, I would contest the fact that they have normal empathy and compassion. I don't know if you could define what is normal empathy and compassion anyway. But he's trying to suggest that, well, Indian people are not really bad. They have capacity for empathy. But I'm looking at this report and thinking, no, not so much. They won't give blood to the family member that's dying. And a stranger, a surgeon, offers up his own blood. You know? Why would he do that?
Compassion.
Huh?
Yes, compassion.
And where does that come from? Why does he have it and they don't have it?
Judeo-Christian foundation, perhaps.
Because he's raised up in a Judeo-Christian cultural environment. And so he thinks differently than they do. They're raised up in a compilation of Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist ethos. And so they don't have that kind of compassion. All right, read on.
The missionary doctor was the opposite of many civil surgeons who demand bribes to operate on the poor. Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim civilizations had ruled India during the preceding 3,500 years. None of them gave us even the concept of a welfare state, a state that exists to serve the citizens. The idea that the state should pay surgeons to serve the poor came to India with the Bible. Secularism hijacked the biblical idea, but it provides only the form, not the spirit. It is possible to bring a mango plant from India and grow it in Minnesota. One might even get a few crops, but under normal circumstances, the tree will not survive and certainly not reproduce in Minnesota's cold climate.
What's his point?
It's difficult to bring like the Western concept, compassion culture to India because you might get it to start a little bit, but it's not going to thrive and survive in their culture,
Yeah.
karma, and
Yeah, you have to tear it down to its base, build it all over again. There was a lot of talk in the 90s and early 2000 about nation building and how we were going to go create democracies in Afghanistan and in Iraq. How'd that turn out? What's happening in Afghanistan right now? You call over there. Who picks up the phone? Taliban. And they're back where they were before we ever showed up and spent billions of dollars and thousands of lives. And we thought we could just take the mango and plant it over there and that it would grow and be fine. We're going to bring mangoes to Afghanistan. And they're like, nah, we raise opium. We raise poppies. So, but that's exactly the point there. We thought we could export democracy, but not on a foundation of tribalism and who knows what underneath all of that. Islam is down in there. Same thing in Iraq. You know, they were having elections, you know, people coming out all proud. They had their purple thumb. They had voted and put their thumbprint on it. And then they were blowing one another up a week after that. So, yeah, it's really hard to export these things. And the reason is because all of these ancient historical things are embedded in that cultural, and it's really, really hard to replace it. Why do you think the United States had such a robust manifestation of these very things that we're talking about? Why have we been able to grow to this point? What are our beginnings? You have to go back. Do what?
God we trust, right?
Yeah, where'd they get that? What does that signify? So you have a quarter and it says, in God we trust, for at least the moment it does. But well, we started our own thing. We started our own government, wrote our own founding documents, made our own money, decided we're going to put in God we trust on our coinage. And God is woven all in through it because it was a new place, new world. And most of the people that came were people that were escaping religious persecution. And they came for the purpose of serving God. They wanted to make money and they wanted to raise their family and they wanted to have liberty and all of that. But the reason it's been so productive is that we could create our own ethos, our own foundational ideas, implant them. And so it wasn't like bringing a mango from somewhere else and trying to get it to grow in an already existing cultural mix. So we got to start our own thing.
Yeah, I liken it to kind of like what used to be my approach. I would come out of Sunday service, and on Monday I'd be on fire, and I would meet someone, and I'd want them to be as excited as I was, and I'm like, why aren't you excited about this? And I'm telling them about these things, and it's like, and it's you have something good, you want to share it, and you take it, and you're like, why isn't it growing? Taking the mango, and it's I realize it's a lot of it's internal. You can't inspire necessarily anybody. You can give them the information, but it has to be internal. They have to want it.
So the person is a field. Their family is a field. Their cultural construct is a field. So take that and apply the parable of the sower to it.
Yeah. So you sow the seed, and if the ground isn't the climate, the atmosphere, the field is full of stones or
Yeah, even if it's good ground, you still have to work it. I mean, it's something to be done there. But yeah, it depends on the predisposition of the soil. It depends on the condition of the soil. And that's true in a real sense, like you're going to grow something in your yard. Auburn would tell you you need to send off a sample and see what you got so you'll know how to rectify all the problems with it. You'll be out there forever trying to get something to grow. And your dirt is poisonous. You know. Okay, well, we got to stop because we have to go to prayer. And it's excellent to be with you today, and good to study with you. So glad for what God is doing, and excited about services today. Brother T, why don't you pray for us?
Mighty God, thank you for everything you're doing, oh God. I pray that you touch the service today, oh God. Touch each word, oh God. I pray that you touch every visitor, oh God. I pray that you touch the Sunday school class, oh God. Anoint your people today, oh God.